Hi there, this is Zach Ryland, and we're doing a short audio podcast here with Aileron just because commonly we get a lot of questions about what conscious leadership is, how it fits into our daily lives, and how we can apply it. So, here with two of the certified professional coaches here at Aileron, I've got Wes Gipe and Chuck Huggins. And fellas, if you don't mind, I'd love to just start by asking, what is conscious leadership?
Sure. So this is Wes. The conscious leadership at the end of the day is about learning to pause our judgment and respond rather than react to situations. There was a study done that suggested that 7% of verbal communication is really influenced by the words that we choose, which is a bit surprising being that it's verbal communication, right? But the other 93% is made up, 55% of it is our nonverbal cues, the way we carry ourselves, where we are spatially from the other person, whether we use touch or not, those sorts of things. And then 38% is our tone, the tone of our voice that we carry. And so that's not to say that last 7% that is words is not important. It's just to say that it's not going to be effective or authentic or believable on the other side of the table if it doesn't match the 93% that's our nonverbal cues. And so at the end of the day, conscious leadership is about systematically learning some things and tools and systems that will allow you to manage that energy and how you show up.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I know as part of getting involved with conscious leadership, one of the first things you do is you take an assessment to learn a little bit more about yourselves. I've done a lot of assessments in the past, whether it's Myers-Briggs, Strengthsfinders, DISC. Can you guys talk about what the difference is between the conscious leadership assessment and others?
Sure, this is Chuck. The big difference is, as Wes talked about, it's really about how you're showing up. So this assessment is different from Myers-Briggs in the sense that Myers-Briggs measures your personality and how you interact with somebody else. So it's really teaching you how to interact with another person. So it's about two people. The great thing about conscious leadership is it's measuring your attitude and your energy. So as Wes mentioned energy earlier, it's how you're showing up in situations both when things are going well and when you're under stress. And the great thing about it is it's all about you. And your attitude is, your results is no indication of what the future could be. It really is just when you took the assessment. So the great thing about attitude is that you have a choice to change it. You have a choice to change how you show up every day. Versus personality, you kind of are who you are. So once you change your attitude, you're gonna influence people differently. So the big difference is attitude versus personality. You can change one versus you can't change the other. So you can take the assessment today, take it 6 months from now, and your results could be really different.
Wow. That's just unusual to think about because you definitely go through life thinking, oh, I'm this type of person, that's what my results say, and I feel like I'm stuck that way and I just need to know more about you. So I can imagine if I'm going to have that kind of change 6 months from now or down the road, there must be some principles or things that I'm working on throughout that time, and it's not just the results themselves.
Yeah, sure. There's really 4 big principles behind the underpin conscious leadership, and the first one is catabolic versus anabolic energy. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. The second one is true versus truth, and the third is suspending judgment, and the fourth is thought, emotion, action.
Yeah. So if you don't mind, I've heard you say energy a couple times now. Like that must be something that's really important to conscious leadership. I think you said catabolic and anabolic energy. Do you mind starting there?
Yeah, sure. So Wes talked a lot about how you show up influences the people around you, and we talk about catabolic and anabolic energy not as one is good or one is bad, but they just are what they are. So catabolic is more about the draining, destructive type energy that you have in your body. You will need that type of energy in some situations, and that's why we don't say it's bad. But if you keep too much of that energy in your body, it just wears you down and tears you down. And eventually, you're not a very good leader with a lot of that catabolic energy in, versus having anabolic energy, which is more uplifting, healing, building type energy. People are more likely want to be around you, want to be led by you. So in conscious leadership, we'll talk a lot about catabolic versus anabolic energy. And a lot of times where you go to catabolic energy is when you start telling yourself stories in your head. And that comes from a concept versus true of true versus truth.
Yeah, so with true versus truth, we like to talk about true. It's this concept that true is what we believe about a situation or our interpretation of the facts, while truth is what the facts would support or what actually happened. And so there's almost always, in a disagreement or a situation where there's tension, and we as leaders have no shortage of those situations, it seems, because it's our role is to create harmony in the organization, keep the organization moving toward a common goal. And so as we step into those situations, it's important for us to remember that what we're perceiving is exactly that. It's what we're perceiving. And if we want to get to the truth of the matter, it's going to require that we do, I think Chuck in a moment is going to talk about suspending judgment, that we suspend judgment until such time as we have all the facts that time will allow us to gather in that particular situation before making a decision. And so it's first important to understand that there's generally a difference. Where there's conflict, where there's unrest between two individuals, each person has their true, if you will, and many times the truth of the matter, what the facts would support, is somewhere in between. So if we suspend judgment, we have an opportunity to get at the truth of the matter, and facts are power when it comes to leadership. Mm-hmm. But Chuck, would you talk a little bit about how to suspend judgment and what that looks like?
Well, if you don't mind, gentlemen, before you go there, just up until a minute ago, true and truth are very similar words. And it's hard for me to start understanding the difference between those and the way you're talking about. Do you have an example or a situation that you could pull on that would clarify the difference?
Sure. So Christopher Columbus is an example that I use from time to time. His belief, his true, was that the world was round, right? And many people in the world at the time believed absolutely that the world was flat. He set off on his ships to prove them otherwise. Another true for Christopher Columbus that he was going to find India. And as it turned out, the Americas got in the way. And so his true was that the world is round, and that I'm going to go off and sail off and find India. The Queen's true was the world is probably flat, but I'm going to give I'm going to fund this trip to actually find out. And the truth of the matter was the world was indeed round, but he wasn't going to find India. He ended up in the Americas.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I could totally see how in the context of our everyday lives and business, me not understanding, first of all, what my own true is, and then what's true to you would be a big deal. So, Chuck, I know you were going to talk a little bit about suspending judgment. How does that factor in?
Yeah, so when you have your version of true, we talk a lot about how do you break through your version of true, and how you do that is suspend judgment, become curious, and sometimes that's hard for people because everybody has their own certain set of lenses that they view every single situation through. And my lens is different than Wes's lens, and our lenses are different than your lens. So and we've got those lenses from our childhood, being brought up a certain way, being told certain things, have experienced certain things. And if you look at a big spiral, at the top of that spiral where it's really big is when we were kids, we had little to no judgment. So we would crawl over to the stairway and tumble down the steps if somebody didn't put a baby gate up in front of us. And we did that because we were curious. We had no judgment on whether we were going to get hurt or not. And as we learned that, things like touching a stove and it was hot and it burned your hand, we learned, and all of a sudden, after 40 years or 50 years, we're down at the bottom of the spiral, and that's our view of the world and everything around us. And what we're trying to do is, as you suspend judgment, to work yourself back up that spiral, be more curious, experience stuff that you wouldn't experience otherwise. And once you start suspending judgment, it's going to work right into you developing new thoughts.
Well, Chuck, I was just going to ask, I'm sorry to interrupt, everything you're talking about with the judgment spiral and suspending judgment, it sounds like we've started judging for a good reason. You mentioned falling down the stairs, you mentioned hot stoves. I do think, I mean, it sounds like it's rational that we're judging situations around us. Do you have any situations where that judgment got in the way and you could have missed out on something? You mentioned things that you could realize.
Yeah, sure. As leaders, we all have to judge. But a lot of times we judge without all the facts. And that's where we get ourselves in trouble. Or we make reactions versus responses. And if you start investigating and being curious, you're gonna be more apt to give a response versus a reaction. And one example for me was when my son was 19 and going to college, and he was sitting at home and looked over at me and said, "Dad, I want to get a tattoo." And my first reaction, because my judgment was that we don't get tattoos in this family, was tattoos are bad. So that's my lens as I see that through. I could have reacted and said, you're not doing very well in school, you're not doing very well in baseball. What the heck are you thinking about? And he probably would have stomped off to his room. But I decided at that point that I wanted to suspend judgment and become curious. So I asked him what was driving him to get a tattoo, and his response was totally different. His head popped up and said to me, "I'm working on a design, can I show you?" And I almost reacted again because I didn't know what to expect. I thought that my true was it was going to be a six-legged monster, something like that he wanted to get a tattoo. But to my surprise, when he sat down, what it was a pair of praying hands with my birthday, my wife's birthday, and my daughter's birthday. Wow. So then I got more curious and said, so tell me more about that. And he said, "Well, you guys mean so much to me." He goes, "I always want to keep you close to my heart." So that's an example of where if I wouldn't have suspended judgment and used my lens that I believe how everything should happen, that conversation would have never happened.
Wow, yeah, that's really powerful. And you were saying a lot of that just goes back to being intentional about your thoughts. So where does that play in, and how do we get started?
So if you're able to suspend judgment and set aside the thought that you've had at the end of the day, judgments are simply thoughts, right? And so if you're able to set that thought aside for just a moment and reconsider the situation, you've got an opportunity to go all the way back to sort of the beginning of our discussion here. You got an opportunity to respond, to choose a response as opposed to just being a victim or captive to your reactions. And so the way that happens, conscious leadership has one of the fundamental principles is thought, emotion, action. And so what that means is essentially it's a progression. So our thoughts create our emotions, and then our emotions are ultimately what drive our actions. And left unchecked, that's just going to be a reaction. So we're going to think something and we're going to react a certain way without really giving it much thought. The more practice we've had at this, the longer we've had this deeply held belief, if you will, or deeply held value, and it's been expressed in this way, the more automatic it's going to be, the more reactionary it's going to be, and we just don't think about it. And this is how we find ourselves in situations setting back and thinking, gosh, well, that could have gone better. And so if you can step in and stop that progression at the emotion or thought stage, you got an opportunity to ask yourself sort of two questions. And those questions are, where am I now from an energy level perspective? And when we say energy, what we're talking about really is many people will say when you can feel the energy of a room. When you step into a room, you can just feel the energy. That's the sort of energy we're talking about here. And so what sort of energy do I want to project in this situation? Said differently, how do I make that 93% that is the nonverbal cues and the tone match the words that I'm about to say or the action that I'm about to display? And so what happens is the stimulus hits us as a human being. So in Chuck's example, his son says, "Hey, Dad, I'm going to get a tattoo." That stimulus, those words are filtered down through the things that we value and the things that we believe as an individual, or that judgment. lens that we were talking about earlier, out of that lens or that filter pops a thought. Now it takes approximately 200 milliseconds to get from stimulus to thought. And so this thought or notion that some have about you shouldn't judge, it's actually physiologically or psychologically impossible not to judge. That's what we do. We judge people, we judge things, we judge situations, we judge where we invest our money, who we hire, how we discipline our children. We judge which school we should send our kids to. We judge all kinds of things every day. So the whole premise is not about not judging, but as Chuck said, suspending that judgment that's already been made in that 200 milliseconds. At that point, we've got a chance to say, okay, where am I now? So initially, Chuck was in a place where we don't get tattoos in this family, to use Chuck's example, right? So that's the thought, and so anybody in their right mind is going to have an emotion of anxiety or fear, perhaps, and that anxiety and fear, if left unchecked, if not suspended, is going to produce an action of shutting him down or stepping away or saying something that we might regret and sending him to his room, And if that cycle happens often enough, that's just going to be an automatic response that we condition the other individual to have based upon how we respond to the stimulus. And so the thought here is that we as humans connect most authentically, easily with the emotions and actions because we feel those are very real. The emotions we feel, the actions we either say or we hear or we do. And so it's easy for us to many folks to identify with particularly the actions, and for a lot of people to identify with the emotions, but it takes some real work to work backwards to, okay, what was I really thinking? What do I really believe that caused me to think and make that 200 millisecond judgment that I made? And is that really, going back to true versus truth, is that really the truth? Or is that just what I believe to be true? Are there some things in that lens that maybe aren't really all that helpful in this particular situation? So if you can do that, you've got a chance to say, okay, gosh, if I don't want to react that way, then what's a new thought that I could think that would drive a different emotion and it would drive a different action, and importantly, an action that would be believable because it would match my energy, right? And so a new thought about that tattoo, to continue to use Chuck's example, is gosh, I wonder what he's thinking. I'm going to get curious instead of getting mad, which will certainly end a conversation. He chose to get curious. I wonder what he's thinking. And then there's an emotion of curiosity and genuine interest that he showed. And then that drew an action from the other individual. His action was curiosity, asking questions, being interested, and that drew a much different action from his son, and further set a precedent for this is you can trust me as another human being. Now, recognizing that's a personal example, people bring themselves to work every day, all of them. Their challenges, their fears, their limitations, their limiting beliefs, their gremlins, their assumptions, their interpretations of situation, everything that's going on at home, everything that's going on in social clubs, everything that may be going on in church, all the stuff that's going on in their family, they're bringing all that to work with them every single day. So we can choose to acknowledge that and really get under what people are feeling that's causing them to act the way they're acting, or not. And the more successful leaders are the ones that are able to check their emotions at the door. We'll talk about that sometimes. Suspend judgment and start asking questions and really demonstrate a spirit of curiosity as opposed to directive nature.
Wow. You guys have given us so much to think about just from these, kind of key concepts. I'll just give you one last question. If this is something that I'm listening and even in my own personal reflection right now, I'm finding is very interesting, I'm intrigued, I want to go further, what should I be thinking about? What should I be working on? How can I take a next step?
Yeah, so I would say one next step would be find somewhere where you can suspend judgment, somewhere small that's safe, that you're able to suspend judgment, be curious, whether it's about a situation or a person, somebody that you wouldn't normally talk to. Take a chance, talk to them, and see how that turns out. Once you start suspending judgment in those small spaces, you'll start gaining momentum. And once you start gaining momentum, you'll start experiencing stuff that you haven't experienced in a long time. And once you start doing that, then you'll be able to challenge what you believe to be true.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, gentlemen, for taking the time to answer some of these key questions, and we hope to be hearing more from you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.